Happy Monday. There's lots of news going on today, including a lot of stuff that has been breaking late in the day and into this evening. So we're keeping an eye tonight, for example, on President Obama's historic trip to Alaska. The president is in Alaska right now. He's going to be there today, tomorrow, and Wednesday. He's giving remarks tonight on the issue of climate change, which is obviously a big part of the reason he is in Alaska. It's also a big question mark over how the president will deal with criticism of him just greenlighting Arctic oil drilling by Shell Oil. So the president making those remarks tonight. He also spent a big portion of today meeting with Native Alaskan groups. So even though it's late in the day, there is still new news happening and new news breaking tonight. That probably means it's going to be a bit of a rollicking show tonight, which is always fun. But we start tonight with some legitimately new news, hot off the presses. What I have in my hot little hand here is new national polling, a new national poll on the presidential race. We've got this exclusively tonight. You have not heard about this anywhere else. So we're breaking this news right here. This is a new national poll on the presidential race from Public Policy Polling. They have polled Republican voters nationwide on the race for the Republican presidential nomination. And what they have found is a mix of good news, including some surprisingly good news for the few folks who find themselves toward the top of these poll results. But what they have also found is just some astonishingly bad news for the folks who find themselves at the bottom of the list. And some of the people who are at the very, very, very bottom of the list will surprise you. Some of these supposedly, top-tier, bold-faced name, national caliber politicians in the Republican field are not just polling at the bottom of the field nationally right now. They're like below the bottom of the field, like you thought you were on the ground floor. And hey, look, turns out there's a basement. In this new PPP poll, which again, we have got exclusively tonight and we are breaking news of right now, it is very good news for some candidates, but very, very bad news for others. So it's Monday. Do you want the good news first or do you want the bad news first? All right, let's do the good news first. Thank you. You didn't think I could hear you, did you? The best good news is, as you might expect, for the unquestioned, unchallenged Republican presidential frontrunner, New York real estate developer Donald Trump. Mr. Trump has led in every single national poll and every one of the early state polls for more than a month now. The closest anybody has come to knocking on his door is one Iowa poll, Iowa-specific poll that came out today from Monmouth, which showed Donald Trump tied with Ben Carson for first place in Iowa in that one poll. But again, even that one doesn't show Ben Carson beating Donald Trump. Nobody beats Donald Trump anymore, anywhere. But this new national poll from PPP tonight, it also has Donald Trump in first place, has him winning by a mile. He's at 29%. Ben Carson in second place in this new national poll. Ben Carson at 15%, which means Donald Trump is almost doubling Ben Carson's level of support. Still, though, those are the only two people in double digits. Those are the two guys who are coming in first and second. This new national poll from PPP, obviously very good news for both Donald Trump and Ben Carson. This new national PPP poll actually means that Donald Trump and Ben Carson are the #1 and #2 choices of Republicans nationwide in 3 of the last 4 national polls. So that top tier is really getting to be very clear. Donald Trump and Ben Carson pretty clearly sitting on top of the Republican presidential field as we head toward Labor Day. And this new PPP poll just underscoring their dominance. This poll also has some relatively good news, though, for Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush, he does only place 3rd in this new PPP poll, and he can't get out of single digits, but still, 9% and coming in 3rd, that constitutes really good news for Jeb Bush right now, the way things have been going for him recently. He's not only been sliding nationally, but in the early states. So Jeb Bush coming in 3rd here tonight in this new national poll, that constitutes probably reason for celebration in Kennebunkport or Miami or Houston. I don't know. Where do the Bushes summer these days? I don't know. The other person who truly does have reason to celebrate in this new national PPP poll is the candidate who comes in only 1 point behind Jeb Bush for a strong 4th place finish. And that candidate is Carly Fiorina. Carly Fiorina polling at 8% nationwide. That is good for 4th place. That is good for her. But that is not a fluke. She's been polling very well over the last few weeks. In this new national PPP poll, look at it. Carly Fiorina polls better than Rand Paul and Chris Christie and Mike Huckabee and Ted Cruz and John Kasich and Marco Rubio and Scott Walker. She beats all of them. All of them, of course, were allowed into the first presidential debate by Fox News and the RNC, while Carly Fiorina was not, because CNN has decided to stick with that terrible idea of having one real debate and one lesser event for some other candidates. And they've decided they're going to use some polling algorithm to divide the candidates between those two competing events. We are in a situation now, thank you CNN, where Carly Fiorina is beating handily in poll after poll after poll, both nationally and in the early states. She's beating lots of other candidates who are on track to be let into the second debate, but CNN is still not planning on letting her in. They're planning on sticking with this kids' table debate plan, which makes absolutely no sense and is a disservice to lots of candidates throughout the various tiers of the giant Republican field. Carly Fiorina's campaign today sending out this sort of fake petition thing. It's really just a way to get your email address. Sending out this petition to try to pressure CNN and the RNC into abandoning their debate plans, which are going to keep her out of the next debate. Finally, some of the other candidates are also starting to speak publicly about how bad this CNN debate plan is, this plan for CNN to follow what Fox News did in the debates. Ben Carson's campaign manager came out and complained about the debate plans to Politico.com today, which is nice, especially given that Ben Carson is for sure going to be on that main debate stage. So his campaign saying that other candidates who are set to be excluded shouldn't be excluded. That's a generous thing for the Carson campaign to be doing. Also on the other end of the spectrum, Rick Perry, God bless him. Yesterday on Fox News, Rick Perry also stepped up and said that debate plan needs to be changed, if only so Carly Fiorina can be on that debate stage.
Carly Fiorina, I've negotiated with Carly before bringing Hewlett-Packard to Houston. I think Carly needs to be on that debate stage. I mean, this is a class act, an extraordinary individual.
That's nice of Rick Perry, right, to say about one of his competitors, particularly when there's absolutely no chance that he himself will be allowed on that debate stage, as long as this kids' table idea is still the plan. So good for the Ben Carson campaign for their generous statement. Good for Rick Perry for that selfless statement there. And of course, the whole idea of Rick Perry brings us to the part of the Republican field for whom this new national poll out tonight from PPP is absolutely terrible and maybe even devastating news. Let's just look at the very bottom tier of this poll. Look at the people who are getting 2% or less. Tied for 10th place at 2% of the vote right now are Rick Santorum, which is about where you might expect Rick Santorum to be, I guess. But who is Rick Santorum tied with? Chris Christie. Chris Christie was supposed to be a top-tier national contender, right? Chris Christie tied with Rick Santorum for 10th place and 2% of the vote nationally right now. And if you think that is bad, Chris Christie is actually sitting pretty compared to Rand Paul. Rand Paul does even worse. Rand Paul right now in this new national poll out from PPP, he's tied with Jim Gilmore at 1% in the polls. Rand Paul, Jim Gilmore, and the aforementioned Rick Perry. I mean, Rick Perry is now down to exactly one campaign staffer in Iowa. He was staking his whole presidential campaign on Iowa. His Iowa campaign chairman left and went to go work for Donald Trump. His campaign co-chair in Iowa, who just a couple of weeks ago, he spent an hour with hand in hand, literally holding hands, walking around the Iowa State Fair with his Iowa co-chair. She just left him too. And she didn't even leave him to go work for the frontrunner. She left him to go work for Rick Santorum. Yeah, Rick Perry is dead in the water. He's down to one last staffer in Iowa. His presidential campaign is no longer really a campaign. It's like a sort of voluntary club where they want to use your name, but you don't really have to do anything, and the only real suspense is whether or not there's going to be a T-shirt for you at the end of it. So Rick Perry is over. He is at 1% in the polls. I mean, Jim Gilmore, I'm sure, is delighted to have 1%. Most people have no idea who Jim Gilmore is, let alone that he's running for president or that he has run for president before. But Rand Paul is tied with those guys at 1%, which does mean he's sitting pretty compared to Lindsey Graham, George Pataki, and Bobby Jindal, all of whom are polling at 0, which is a number by which you cannot divide, so sometimes it's just easier to say they scratched. And maybe we expect that now. Maybe we expect Bobby Jindal and Lindsey Graham to scratch, right, to poll at 0%. we now ought to expect Donald Trump and Ben Carson to be leading in every poll. But who expected Chris Christie to be tied with Rick Santorum and Rand Paul to be tied with Jim Gilmore, right? At 2% and 1% respectively. This is just disastrous news for them. And this new PPP poll that we've got exclusively tonight, that we are breaking news about here right now, right here tonight, this is a national poll. But the bad news part of these findings, especially for the candidates who are supposed to be real contenders, supposed to be top-tier guys, the bad news part of these findings from PPP in their national poll tonight, those bad news findings really are replicated in the early state polls that are out today and yesterday as well. I mentioned earlier that Monmouth, Iowa poll, which has this interesting finding right at the top with Donald Trump and Ben Carson tied. Well, down at the bottom end of that poll, looks very familiar, right? Chris Christie at 1% of the vote. He's in a three-way tie for 12th place, along with Bobby Jindal and Rick Perry. Rand Paul is in 9th place with 3% of the vote. That's the Monmouth, Iowa poll that's out today. The gold standard Iowa poll is still considered to be the one done by the Des Moines Register. That poll came out yesterday. It's also a grim picture down in the small numbers. Chris Christie in a three-way tie for 10th place with 2% of the vote. Rand Paul tied for 8th place with 4% of the vote. The real problem for these campaigns, though, as we head toward Labor Day and that sort of psychological political barrier of Labor Day, the real problem for these campaigns right now is that none of this seems like a fluke anymore. Donald Trump really is at a resilient and now pretty long-standing, secure position at the top of the polls. This is not one of those week-long flirtations like a few different candidates had in 2008 or even in 2012. This isn't Newt Gingrich's mini surge after he had that one good debate, right? This isn't the brief 999 madness of Herman Cain presidential frontrunner. I mean, Donald Trump is up at the top. He appears to be staying up there at the top. And just as indelibly, at least it looks like now, guys like Chris Christie and Rick Perry and Bobby Jindal, but particularly guys who are supposed to be real contenders, guys like Chris Christie and Rand Paul, they're also really not moving anymore. And it's one thing to survive a brief plunge in the polls, right? To rocket down into the small single digits because you're having a low spot here or there. It's another thing to become a permanent part of this distant third tier of candidates that regularly polls at 2% or less, right? These irrelevant rounding error candidates that are undeniably ignorable. If you want to be seen and treated as a viable presidential contender, it is one thing to visit that tier occasionally. But when you start to live there, it starts to be over for you. For those candidates, though, who are being just roundly and now consistently rejected by Republican voters this year, I will say one little happy thing. This new PPP poll that we are breaking news of here tonight, it does have one little ray of sunshine for the losers. It's maybe not a ray of sunshine. It's more like a reason to laugh mirthlessly into your beer as you ponder how low you've sunk. But it is from another part of the same PPP poll, which we've got exclusively tonight. In addition to asking who these Republican voters wanted to be the Republican nominee for president, it also asked Republican voters nationwide some of their other views. And I can't help but think that this has to be a comfort to some of the people who believed the hype, right? Who believed their own press. Some of the people who really thought they would be real contenders for the presidency, but who can't get any traction with real Republican voters. I have to think that the answers to these polling questions tonight have got to be a comfort to guys like Chris Christie, guys like Bobby Jindal, guys like Rick Perry, people who just can't get anywhere. This question was asked of all the Republican voters in the PPP poll. Quote, do you think Barack Obama is a Christian or a Muslim, or are you not sure? 14% of Republican voters say President Obama is a Christian. 14%. The percentage of Republican voters who say he's a Muslim, 54%. And the percentage of Republican voters who say they aren't sure whether or not President Obama is a Christian, that is 32%. President Obama is, in fact, a Christian. But 86% of the Republican electorate either doesn't believe that or they're not sure. Similarly, this was question 28 in the new poll. Dear Republican voters, do you think Barack Obama, President of the United States, was born in the United States? The proportion of Republican voters who say yes, President Obama was born in the U.S. is 29%. The proportion who say no, he wasn't born in the United States is 44%. and another 26% aren't sure. In fact, President Obama was born in the United States. Do I have to say it? But fully 70% of the Republican electorate just doesn't believe that, or they say they don't know. Only 29% of Republican voters think that President Obama is actually president. Because if he was secretly foreign, he couldn't be, right? 29% of Republicans think that President Obama was born in the U.S. 29%. PPP then asked the world's most perfect follow-up question. They asked these same voters, okay, 29% of you believe, only 29% of you believe that President Obama was born in the United States. Do you guys think that Ted Cruz was born in the United States? Even though only 29% of Americans think that President Obama was born in the U.S., 40% of them think that Ted Cruz was. Ted Cruz was not born in the United States. He was born in Canada. But more Republicans think that he was born in the U.S. than think that of our own president by a big double-digit margin. So, you know, you're Bobby Jindal. You're looking at these numbers. You're Chris Christie. You're Rand Paul. You're poor Rick Perry. You know, you're looking at these numbers. You cannot get a vote or a poll number out of the Republican electorate to save your political life. Republican voters just cannot stand you, and they're not budging. I have to think that for those candidates, it has to be some small comfort that Republican voters also, provably, have no freaking idea what they're talking about. Joining us now is Tom Jensen, Director of Public Policy Polling. Mr. Jensen, thank you for being here. Thanks for giving us access to this new national poll.
It's great to be with you, Rachel.
I have to ask you, I know that the top line here is the Republican presidential results. I have to ask you if you were surprised by the birther numbers among the Republican electorate, that so few of them believe President Obama was born in the U.S.
I would be surprised if it hadn't been what we've been finding in the polling for the last 6 years, and it's really consistent with what we found over time. I think what this poll was really illuminating about is who Donald Trump supporters are. More than 60% of Donald Trump supporters think Barack Obama is a Muslim. More than 60% think he was born in another country. More than 60% of them want to deport children. And I think that these are attitudes that Republican voters in the country have had a long time, but they're kind of things that you weren't allowed to talk about in public. And now you have the Republican frontrunner talking about all of these things in public and not apologizing for it one little bit. It's not surprising that these kinds of voters are really gravitating towards Mr. Trump.
Are you finding, in terms of the minority of Republicans who believe President Obama was born in the United States, who believe that President Obama is a Christian, who don't want to deport children, are you finding that Republicans who have more centrist views or more rational views on these things, are you finding that they're gravitating toward any particular candidate in the Republican field, or are they such a small number that their influence doesn't show up?
Well, here's what we found is that there's only 3 Republican candidates whose supporters think Barack Obama was born in the United States and that he's a Christian. Those were Jeb Bush, John Kasich, and Chris Christie. Obviously, having the support of those kind of people is only good enough to get Chris Christie to 1%. John Kasich at least has a little bit of momentum. But what I think is really interesting is Jeb Bush. He is in 3rd place at 9%. But when you look at his favorability numbers, overall, more Republican voters nationally have a negative opinion of Jeb Bush than a positive one. And what's really driving down those numbers is that when you look at very conservative voters, they have quite an unfavorable opinion of Jeb Bush. And I think sort of the lesson you take from that is that with the Republican electorate this extreme, even when you're not that moderate, I mean, you're the brother of one of the most conservative presidents in the history of the country, that's still not enough to please this dominant right wing of the Republican Party.
The other thing that is, I think, striking here in these numbers is sort of the combined performance of the 3 high-profile candidates who have no political experience whatsoever: Donald Trump, Ben Carson, and Carly Fiorina, placing 1st, 2nd, and 4th in your poll. Combining that with this interesting Monmouth, Iowa poll that's out today, which has Ben Carson and Donald Trump tied in Iowa, has me wondering about the particularities of Ben Carson's support. Are you finding that there's any distinguishable difference between a Donald Trump supporter and a Ben Carson supporter?
No, Ben Carson is really tapping into the same sort of conservative outrage that Donald Trump is. And what's really interesting about Carson's numbers is we're actually now consistently finding him to be the most broadly popular candidate in the Republican field. Even though Donald Trump had the most people who said he was their first choice on this poll, Carson actually had the highest favorability rating. And when you look at Trump supporters, they say Carson's their second choice. So if at some point Trump does implode, as he's long been expected to but hasn't yet, Carson may be a beneficiary.
Tom Jensen, Director of Public Policy Polling, thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing this new national poll with us. It's great to be able to break this news. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Again, the top line here will always be who's at the top of the polls. Donald Trump at 29% in this new PPP national poll. Second place, the only other candidate with double digits in this new national poll is Ben Carson at 15%. Everybody else is in single digits. But as far as I'm concerned, the big news here is what's happening at the very bottom of the Republican race for president. At 2% and tied with Rick Santorum is New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, and at 1% tied with Rick Perry and Jim Gilmore is Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, who the Beltway keeps saying is the most intriguing man in politics. 1% and tied with Jim Gilmore. That is intriguing.